Blood always smells like copper and bad decisions. Caroline knew this better than anyone in County General's ER. She spent her nights taping up bar fights, hiding calloused hands that had once stitched together torn arteries under heavy mortar fire. Nobody suspected a thing. Until Tuesday. Fluorescent lights do not hum. They buzz with a frantic, dying insect frequency that gets into your teeth if you listen long enough. Caroline stood at the triage desk, staring at the flashing cursor on her monitor, letting the sound vibrate through her jaw. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The ER smelled, as it always did at this hour, of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the sour sweat of anxious people. She peeled a piece of medical tape off the edge of the desk, her thumbnail scraping against the faux wood laminate. Her hands were unremarkable. Short, unpolished nails, faded knuckles. They were hands that looked perfectly suited to entering insurance details and handing out plastic cups of ice chips. "Hey, Caroline," a voice called out, breaking the low murmur of the waiting room. It was Dr. Hayes. He was 28, a second-year resident who still wore his stethoscope around his neck like a medal. His scrubs were too stiff. He hadn't washed them enough times to break down the heavy cotton. "Got a laceration in bed 4. Motor vehicle accident, but he walked in. Thinks he's fine." "I'm going to suture," Hayes said, dragging a hand through his gelled hair. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes bruising purple. "You want the lidocaine with epinephrine?" Caroline asked, her voice flat, gravelly from a night of disuse. Yeah, good call. Faces bleed a lot." Caroline didn't smile. She just nodded, turning toward the supply closet. She knew faces bled a lot. She knew exactly how much blood a human body held, about 5 liters, and she knew exactly what it looked like when 3 of those liters soaked into the sandy floor of a Humvee. She pushed the thought down, a well-practiced reflex like swallowing a pill dry. Bed 4 was a mess of tangled sheets and the sharp reek of cheap whiskey. The patient, a man in his 40s with a violently bruised steering wheel mark across his chest, was arguing with a nurse tech. He had a deep gash over his left eyebrow. The blood had dried into a crusty, dark maroon trail down his cheek, but fresh crimson welled up every time he shouted. "I just need to go home, man," the patient slurred, trying to swing his legs over the side of the bed. "Sir, you need to lie back," Hayes said, stepping into the curtained enclosure. He held up a needle, projecting what he thought was medical authority. It only made the drunk man angrier. "Don't come near me with that," the man spat. Caroline stepped into the space. She didn't announce her presence. She just moved to the head of the bed, her rubber-soled clogs silent on the linoleum. She didn't ask the man to lie down. She didn't use the high-pitched, placating voice they taught in nursing school. She placed one hand flat on his sternum. Just a resting weight, not a push, but a boundary. "You're going to lie back," Caroline said. Her tone was completely devoid of emotion. It was an order, stripped of anger or pleading. It was the voice of someone who expected absolute compliance. The man blinked, the aggression faltering as he looked up at her tired, grey eyes. He felt the firm, immovable weight of her palm against his chest. Slowly, he slid back onto the mattress. "Hold his head," Hayes muttered to Caroline, looking relieved. Caroline put her thumbs on the man's cheekbones, her fingers splayed into his greasy hair. She kept his skull rigid. As Hayes began to inject the local anesthetic, his hand shook slightly. The needle slipped, angling wrong. Caroline's fingers shifted a fraction of an inch, pressing a specific pressure point near the temple, subtly redirecting the angle of the man's face so the needle found the right tissue without Hayes even realizing he'd been corrected. "Good," Caroline murmured, though it wasn't clear if she was talking to the patient or the doctor. When it was over, she washed her hands in the small sink, the water scalding hot. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, watching the pink-tinged suds circle the drain. There was no adrenaline here, just the slow, grinding machinery of civilian trauma. A broken arm, a bruised rib, a bad choice. It was safe. It was maddening. She dried her hands on rough brown paper towels and walked back to the break room. She wanted silence, but the TV in the corner was muttering the early morning news. The smell of someone's microwaved lasagna from hours ago lingered in the stale air. Caroline poured a cup of sludge from the bottom of the coffee pot. She took a sip. It was bitter, burnt, and cold. Perfect. She sat in a plastic chair, staring at the blank wall, consciously ignoring the phantom smell of cordite and diesel exhaust that sometimes crept into the back of her throat when she was too tired to block it out. Just 4 more hours until her shift ended. Just 4 more hours of being nobody. The shift change at 7 a.m. brought a harsh, unforgiving daylight to the hospital. It streamed through the large glass doors of the lobby, illuminating dust motes and the scuffed floor polish. Caroline pushed open the heavy locker room door, her canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. She had changed out of her scrubs into a pair of worn denim jeans and a heavy, dark green canvas jacket. She looked like 100 other exhausted night shift workers shuffling out into the cold morning. Her neck was stiff, a dull ache radiating down her spine. She just wanted her bed. She wanted the blackout curtains and the heavy hum of her bedroom fan. Because the east exit was blocked by a scaffolding crew, she was forced to walk through the main waiting area. It was mostly empty, a few people sleeping across the vinyl chairs, an elderly woman staring blankly at a daytime talk show. And then she saw them. They didn't belong here. Even before her eyes registered their faces, her nervous system recognized the anomaly. 3 men. They were standing near the vending machines, but they weren't buying anything. They stood with that unnatural, relaxed stillness that comes only from years of carrying heavy plates of Kevlar. Civilian clothes, flannel, dark jeans, work boots. But the clothes draped over them awkwardly, failing to hide the rigid posture, the way their eyes continuously scanned the exits, the subtle, unconscious spacing between them. Far enough apart to not be a single target, close enough to cover each other. Caroline stopped walking. Her grip on the straps of her backpack tightened until her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. Her stomach bottomed out, a cold rush of nausea pooling in her gut. She felt an immediate, irrational urge to turn around and sprint back into the ER, to hide in the supply closet among the sterile gauze and saline bags. They hadn't seen her yet. She could just keep walking, keep her head down. Then the tallest of the 3 shifted his weight. He had a thick, silver-streaked beard and a cane leaning against his left leg. A heavy brace braced his knee. Miller. Next to him was a younger man with severe burn scars, pulling the skin of his neck taut beneath his collar. Griggs. And standing in front, staring directly at the hallway she had just emerged from, was a broad-shouldered man with a sharp, unforgiving jawline and eyes as dark as wet slate. Donovan. Caroline's breathing hitched. The hospital sounds, the beeping monitors, the squeaking wheels of a gurney, the low chatter of nurses, faded into a dull, underwater rushing in her ears. Donovan's head snapped toward her. The eye contact was a physical blow. He didn't smile. None of them did. The atmosphere in the corner of the waiting room suddenly felt dense, oxygen-starved. Caroline forced her legs to move. She didn't walk toward them with the grace of a reunited comrade. She walked toward them like a cornered animal, her jaw set, her eyes darting to the glass doors leading to the parking lot. She stopped 5 feet away. The scent of them hit her. Cold morning air, old leather, and a faint, sharp trace of gun oil that probably never really washed out of their pores. "What are you doing here?" Caroline asked. Her voice wasn't warm. It was barely above a whisper, harsh and defensive. Donovan looked at her. He took in her tired eyes, her plain clothes, the defensive fold of her arms across her chest. "Hard woman to find, Doc," Donovan said. His voice was gravel, rough and deep. He didn't call her Caroline. He didn't call her nurse. "I'm not a doc anymore. I'm a nurse. And I didn't want to be found," she snapped, glancing around to see if anyone was watching them. A passing orderly pushed a cart of clean linens, completely oblivious to the sudden spike in tension. "We know," Griggs said softly. He stepped forward slightly, the burn scars on his neck stretching. "We've been looking for you for 2 years. "Why?" Caroline demanded, a sharp edge of panic creeping into her chest. She didn't want them here. She didn't want the memories they brought with them. She had spent 2 years building a sterile, quiet life where the worst thing that happened was a botched suture or a delayed ambulance. They were bringing the dirt, the blood, and the noise right into her clean, white hallway. "Because we didn't get to say it," Miller rumbled from the back, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked older, broken down. "You dragged me out of that canyon, Doc. You kept your thumbs inside my thigh for 45 minutes while we waited for the bird. You didn't leave." "It was my job," Caroline said, looking away. She stared at the speckled linoleum floor. She could feel the phantom slickness of Miller's blood on her hands, the terrifying weakness of his pulse under her fingers as the dust stormed around them. "I was a medic. I did my job. You don't need to track me down like a fugitive to say thank you." "It's not just a thank you," Donovan said, taking a slow step closer. He reached into his leather jacket. Caroline flinched, a microscopic involuntary twitch of her shoulders. Donovan paused, recognizing the movement for what it was, the hypervigilance that never really turned off. He moved his hand slower, pulling out a small, worn manila envelope. "We didn't come here to drag you back," Donovan said quietly, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. "We came because the unit got disbanded, and they were going to throw away the records." He held out the envelope. The paper was creased, the edges soft from being carried in a pocket for a long time. "What is this?" Caroline asked, her voice cracking. She didn't reach for it. "It's the after-action report from the extraction," Donovan said. "The real one, not the redacted bullshit they filed. The one that says exactly what you did." Caroline stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. Her chest felt tight, the air trapped in her lungs. She had spent 24 months trying to forget the extraction. She had scrubbed her hands raw 1,000 times, trying to wash away the memory of the men she couldn't save that night. "I don't want it," she whispered, taking a step back. "I don't want to remember." "You don't have to read it," Griggs said gently. "But you need to own it. You saved us, Doc. We're standing here breathing because of you. We couldn't let you just disappear into a hospital and pretend it never happened." Caroline looked up, her vision blurring as the harsh fluorescent lights fractured through sudden tears she refused to let fall. She looked at Miller's ruined leg, at Griggs's scarred neck, at the heavy, tired weight on Donovan's shoulders. They were damaged. They were broken. Just like her. Slowly, her hand shaking, she reached out and took the envelope. The paper felt heavy, loaded with ghosts. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice barely audible. But her fingers closed tightly around the envelope, holding it against her chest like a shield. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of grey light piercing the gap in her bedroom curtains. Caroline sat on the edge of her mattress, staring blankly at the uneven floorboards. She hadn't bothered to take off her boots. Heavy, rubber-soled hospital clogs had been replaced hours ago by scuffed leather combat boots she told everyone she bought at a surplus store. Her apartment smelled of old lavender detergent and stale cooking grease from the diner downstairs. Cold air seeped through the poorly sealed window panes, biting at her ankles. She hadn't turned the radiator on. Cold kept you awake. Cold kept you sharp. In her lap, resting against the worn, damp denim of her jeans, sat the manila envelope. Fingers trembling violently, she traced the creased edge of the cheap paper. It felt brittle, rough against her calloused skin. Donovan had probably carried it across 3 state lines, tucked inside the leather of his jacket, letting his own body heat warp the edges. She wanted to drop it into the metal trash bin beside her desk and strike a match. Fire cleanses everything. Fire turns history into ash. Instead, she slid her thumb under the glued flap, hesitating as the aged adhesive resisted. Paper tore with a sharp, dry rasp that sounded entirely too loud in the quiet room. Inside rested a thick stack of standard military-issue forms, held together by a rusted staple at the top corner. Faded ink formed blocky, impersonal letters, but the stamped red words, classified eyes only, bled aggressively through the thin sheets. Caroline stared at the first page. She deliberately unfocused her eyes, refusing to read the words, but the rigid format of the document was enough. Suddenly, she wasn't sitting in her chilly Chicago apartment anymore. Heat slammed into her chest, heavy, suffocating, and reeking of sulfur. Fine, chalky desert dust coated her throat, clinging instantly to her sweat-soaked skin. She tasted battery acid, copper, and raw adrenaline. "Get on the gun!" a voice screamed, shredding her eardrums. It was Miller. His voice cracked with a high-pitched panic she had never heard from him before, a sound that violated everything she knew about the giant, stoic man. Deafening staccato pops echoed inside her skull, vibrations rattling her teeth. It was an insurgent ambush in a nameless, sun-baked ravine. Plumes of sand kicked up where bullets chewed the dirt inches from her face. The nauseating smell of burning rubber and melted plastic from the destroyed transport vehicle filled her nose, mixing heavily with the sharp tang of fresh blood. She remembered the brutal, tearing drag of the heavy canvas straps digging into her shoulders as she pulled Miller behind the smoking shell of the shattered truck. His leg was a ruined, unrecognizable mess of jagged white bone and dark, rapidly pooling crimson tissue. Desperation made her hands slick. She had shoved her fingers directly into the torn muscle, hunting blindly for the slippery, pulsing tube of the femoral artery. Memory expanded, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She remembered the suffocating pressure of the rotor wash when the medevac chopper finally crested the rocky ridge. Sand whipped her face like tiny needles, blinding her, but she hadn't closed her eyes. She couldn't. If she blinked, Miller would bleed out. The deafening thud of the helicopter blades vibrated deep in her chest cavity, syncing with her racing heartbeat. Griggs had been screaming from the stretcher next to them, the smell of burnt flesh rising off his neck, while Donovan laid down suppressive fire, his rifle barrel glowing white-hot in the fading desert light. Caroline blinked hard, her breath hitching as she forced the bedroom walls to snap back into focus. She gasped, her lungs pulling in the cool, lavender-scented air of her apartment, desperate to expel the phantom heat of the canyon. Her hands were gripping the edges of the report so tightly the paper was tearing under her thumbs. Breathing in slow, measured counts of 4, she forced her jaw to unclench. She was safe. She was sitting in a city. The ravine was 6,000 miles away, buried under 2 years of civilian life. But the paper in her hands was a physical tether, wrapping tightly around her neck and dragging her back to the dirt. Scanning the second page, her eyes caught helplessly on a specific paragraph. It detailed her actions with clinical detachment. Medic held direct manual pressure on severed femoral artery for 47 minutes under sustained enemy fire. Refused direct order to abandon position and fall back to secondary extraction point. Tears, hot, shameful, and entirely unwanted, spilled over her lower lashes. She scrubbed them away violently with the rough canvas of her jacket sleeve, leaving a painful red smear across her cheekbone. She wasn't a hero. She had stayed because Miller was screaming, and if she let go of his leg, he would be dead in under 2 minutes. She couldn't stand the thought of zipping up another body bag, couldn't bear the crushing guilt of being the one who walked away unharmed. It was selfishness. It was stubborn, ugly, animal desperation. Brass called it valor. She threw the report onto the rumpled duvet. It slid, coming to rest against her flat pillow. Stripping off her heavy jacket, she walked into the tiny bathroom and twisted the shower handle all the way to the cold side. Ice water hammered against the cracked tiles. She stepped under the spray in her clothes, letting the freezing water shock her system. Her heavy cotton t-shirt clung to her ribs, dragging her down. She stood completely still as the water pounded her shoulders, trying to wash away the invisible grit deeply embedded in her pores. She watched the water swirl down the rusted drain, expecting it to run pink with blood, just like it did in her nightmares. But it was clear, clean. The realization felt like a bitter betrayal. She had survived, and the only evidence left of that day was locked in a manila envelope on her bed, and in the ruined bodies of the men who had tracked her down. She slid down the wet tile wall, pulling her knees tightly to her chest, and let the cold water drown out the sound of her own ragged breathing. Neon light from the diner sign across the street buzzed angrily, casting jagged red shadows through her rainy window pane. It was exactly 8 in the evening. Caroline had slept for barely 3 hours, a fitful, violent sleep that left her jaw aching from grinding her teeth and her sheets tangled around her ankles like restraints. Coffee was the only priority. Her body demanded caffeine to stop the low-grade tremor in her hands. Pulling on a thick, dark grey hoodie over a dry t-shirt, she stepped out into the damp, unforgiving city air. Rain smelled heavily of wet concrete, stale exhaust, and ozone. A sharp, grounding contrast to the antiseptic sting of the emergency room. Cars hissed over wet asphalt, their headlights cutting sharply through the evening fog. Pushing open the heavy glass door of the diner, she expected the usual evening crowd of exhausted taxi drivers and college students hunched over open laptops. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful metallic sound that grated on her nerves. Donovan, Miller, and Griggs were crammed into a corner booth in the back. They looked utterly out of place. 3 massive, dangerously capable men, wedged awkwardly into cracked red vinyl seating, hunched over small, delicate porcelain coffee cups. Miller had his bad legs stretched straight out into the narrow aisle, the heavy metal brace catching the dull overhead light. Caroline froze with her hand still gripping the cold metal door handle. Her chest tightened. She could turn around. She could walk back up the stairs to her apartment, lock the deadbolt, and pretend she had never seen them. They would leave eventually. Soldiers always moved on. Donovan looked up from his cup. His dark, impenetrable eyes locked onto hers across the room, immediately reading the flight response, stiffening her posture. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just lifted his coffee mug slightly in her direction. A silent acknowledgement, a challenge, an invitation. Letting the heavy glass door swing shut behind her, Caroline walked forward. Her wet boots squeaked loudly against the sticky checkerboard linoleum. She stopped at the edge of their booth, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You guys are completely terrible at disappearing," she said. Her voice sounded raspy, entirely stripped of its usual guarded professional neutrality. "Miller wanted pie," Griggs murmured, not looking up from his plate of half-eaten eggs and greasy hash browns. The aggressive burn scars pulling at his neck looked marginally less severe in the dim, forgiving yellow light of the diner booth. "Cherry. They never have cherry." "It's a federal crime," Miller grunted, shifting his braced leg with a wince he actively tried to hide. He looked up at her, his weathered face softening into an expression that was raw and painfully unguarded. "Sit down, Doc." Caroline slid into the booth next to Donovan. She didn't bother correcting Miller about the title. The cheap vinyl squealed under her weight. Donovan pushed a thick, clean mug toward her and poured black coffee from a dented metal carafe. Steam curled up from the dark, bitter liquid. She wrapped both hands around the hot porcelain, letting the intense heat seep into her freezing fingers, grounding her firmly in the physical sensation. Across the diner, a tired waitress holding a stack of ceramic plates bumped her hip hard against a table corner. Ceramic plates stacked high slipped from her grip, shattering against the hard linoleum with a sharp, violent crack. In less than a second, 4 bodies reacted with terrifying synchronization. Miller's hand darted beneath his heavy jacket. Griggs flinched, dropping his center of gravity, shoulders rolling forward to protect his vulnerable neck. Donovan didn't blink, but his eyes instantly tracked the exits, his body tensing like a coiled spring ready to launch. Caroline had dropped her coffee mug. Her hand hovered in the air, fingers curled tightly as if reaching for a tourniquet that wasn't on her belt. Her heart hammered brutally against her ribs, adrenaline flooding her veins in a toxic, instantaneous rush. Silence stretched thick in the diner, broken only by the waitress apologizing profusely to a startled customer. Slowly, the 4 of them relaxed. Miller pulled his empty hand out from his jacket, rubbing his bearded jaw. Griggs picked up his metal fork, though his fingers were visibly shaking. Donovan wiped spilled coffee off the table with a cheap paper napkin, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Caroline looked at her empty hand, then up at Donovan. The shared reflex was a language no one else in the room spoke. It was horrifying. It was validating. They were all exactly the same kind of broken. "I read the file," Caroline said quietly, her voice trembling slightly as the adrenaline receded, leaving her hollow and exhausted. Donovan shifted beside her. The heavy leather of his jacket creaked. "And?" "It's clinical. It makes it sound like a simple math equation. Move point A to point B, apply pressure, extricate." She looked up, finally meeting Donovan's steady gaze, letting her anger and deep vulnerability show. "It doesn't say that I threw up in the back of the chopper. It doesn't say that I was shaking so badly I couldn't even see the IV line to tape it down." "Nobody cares if you threw up, Caroline," Donovan said softly. It was the first time he had spoken her actual name. "We only care that you didn't let go of the artery." Griggs reached across the sticky table, his badly scarred hand resting lightly over her tense knuckles. His skin was rough, grafted and tight, but his grip was steady and incredibly warm. "You kept us in this world, Doc. You carry that weight. Stop trying to hide from it." Caroline swallowed hard. The lump in her throat felt exactly like swallowed glass. She looked at these 3 broken, dangerous, surviving men, and for the first time in 24 months, she didn't see the ghosts of her failure. She saw living, breathing proof that she had done enough. "I have a shift tomorrow night," she whispered, pulling her hand back slowly to trace the chipped rim of her mug. 12 hours, triage desk. Lots of paper cuts?" Miller asked, a faint, genuine smirk playing at the corner of his bearded mouth. Drunks mostly. A few car wrecks if this rain keeps up. A tiny, genuine smile cracked her rigid, stoic expression, feeling foreign and strange on her facial muscles. It's a quiet room. Good, Donovan said, leaning back against the red vinyl, his broad shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. You earned a quiet room. They sat together and drank their terrible diner coffee as the storm picked up outside, lashing rain against the thick glass. Caroline didn't magically feel fixed. The dark memories were absolutely still there, and the phantom smell of copper would probably always hide in the back of her mind. She would still jump at loud noises. She would still scrub her hands raw on the bad nights, but sitting there in the warm diner, breathing in the scent of wet wool and burnt coffee, the suffocating weight pressing down on her chest felt just a fraction lighter. She wasn't just the quiet ER nurse anymore. She was Caroline, and she knew she could finally stop running. What did you think of Caroline's hidden past? Trauma doesn't just vanish, and real heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear faded scrubs and carry burdens nobody else can see. If this gritty, emotional story hit close to home, please hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this video with someone who appreciates raw, grounded storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human dramas every week. Drop a comment below with your thoughts.